Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you new science fiction stories, a new world, a new adventure. And yes, there is no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So let's start this journey, and please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates. Let's have a story. Okay.
Magistrate Thren Vorkassel of the Vorek Dominion had annexed 41 worlds, and not one of them had taken longer than an afternoon. He expected the 42nd to be faster. The colony was barely worth the ink. It was called Vesper's Reach, a thin smear of farmland and ore pits on a dry planet at the edge of charted space. 11,000 humans, no fleet, no defensive grid, no army worth the word. The Dominion did not bother with such places by force. The Dominion arrived, presented the lawful claim, and the claim was honored because that was how strength worked. The strong wrote the law and the weak signed it. Thren felt the truth of this in the way his kind felt all truths as pressure. The Vorek did not read a room. They weighed it. Authority sat on the air like heat off stone, and a Vorek officer could walk into any chamber and know in an instant who outranked whom, who would yield, who would have to be made to. It had never once failed him. A submitting mind put out almost no weight at all. So when he stepped through the door of the colony's single administrative office and felt nothing, he assumed the room was empty. It was not empty. Behind a wooden desk sat a small, gray-haired human female. She was perhaps 60 in their years, soft in the way the old went soft, with reading lenses pushed up onto her forehead and ink on 2 fingers. Around her rose neat towers of paper, and behind her a wall of drawers ran from floor to ceiling, each one labeled in a careful hand. He weighed her and got almost nothing back. A flat, patient quiet, like a stone at the bottom of a well. For one strange moment he thought his sense had failed. "Good morning," the woman said. She set down her pen. "You'll be from the Dominion." "I am the annexation magistrate," Thren said. "This world is now claimed under Dominion law. Your administration is dissolved. Bring me whoever keeps your records." The woman smiled. It was not a frightened smile, and it was not a defiant one. It was the smile of someone who had been expecting a guest and was pleased he had arrived on time. "That would be me," she said. "Margaret Oak. Sit down, magistrate. You've had a long journey. I'll put the kettle on." "I do not require refreshment. I require your surrender." "Of course," said Margaret. "We'll get to all of that. Procedure is procedure." She rose, set a chipped cup before him, and filled it with something pale and steaming. "But first I'll need you to complete the intake form. We can't begin an annexation without one. It wouldn't be lawful." Thren looked at the cup. He did not touch it. He had crushed planetary governments who had wept and begged and threatened, and none of them had offered him tea. "You misunderstand," he said. "I do not file, you file, I claim." "And the claim has to be recorded," she said pleasantly, sliding a single sheet across the desk. "By the claimant, in triplicate, Dominion Annexation Code, Article 1. I'd never presume to fill it out for you, that would void it on a technicality, and then where would we both be?" The pressure in the room had not changed. She put out no weight at all. And yet he stood there holding a pen he did not remember being handed, looking at a form he could not, under his own law, refuse to complete. He filled it out. It took 4 minutes. He told himself it cost him nothing. He was wrong, but it would be 11 weeks before he understood how wrong. The intake form, once filed, triggered a mandatory verification hold. Margaret showed him the clause herself, tracing it with one ink-stained finger, apologizing the whole time. Article 1 required the Dominion to verify the accuracy of its own claim before the claim could proceed. 72 standard hours. It was there to prevent fraudulent annexations, she explained, which the Dominion's own founders had been very proud of because the Dominion did not steal. The Dominion claimed lawfully. That was the entire point of the Dominion. "It's a beautiful piece of law, honestly," she said, refilling his untouched cup. "Your founders thought of everything. You can't claim a world you haven't surveyed, you can't survey a world you haven't filed for, and you can't file for one you haven't verified. Tea's gone cold, let me get you a fresh one. I do not drink it. All the same. Thren returned to his ship and told his adjutant the conquest would take 3 days. The adjutant, who sensed his commander's pressure the way Thren sensed everyone else's, noted privately that the magistrate's weight had thinned by a measurable degree and said nothing. On the 4th day Thren came back. The verification was complete. He laid the certified result on the desk with some satisfaction and asked to receive the colony's transfer of authority. "Wonderful," said Margaret. "That clears the hold. Now we move to the survey phase." She produced the next form. "The Dominion can't take possession of assets it hasn't catalogued, Article 2. You'll need to register every parcel of land, every structure, every water right, every grain silo in sequence. I've prepared the master ledger. It's only 41,000 entries." 41,000. "We're a farming world, magistrate. We count everything. My predecessor counted everything and her predecessor before her." Margaret looked up, and for the first time he noticed her eyes were very clear. "We've always been good at counting. It's most of what we do out here. There isn't much else." He weighed her again. Nothing. A stone at the bottom of a well. He took the ledger. He told himself again that it cost him nothing, that an empire that had broken battle fleets could surely process a farm inventory. He set 6 of his officers to the task. They worked for 9 days. On the 10th day, Margaret reviewed their work, found that 3 entries had been logged out of sequence, and informed him, with genuine regret, that out-of-sequence registration voided the survey under Article 2, and the survey would have to begin again from the first parcel. "I'm so sorry," she said, and poured the tea. "Procedure is procedure. If we let it slip even once, none of it means anything, does it? Then we'd just be taking. And the Dominion doesn't take. You told me so yourself." The cup steamed between them. He did not drink it. The stack of completed forms on her desk was now taller than the cup. He had not noticed it growing. The weeks went on, and the weeks were made of paper. Thren was not a stupid being. He understood, somewhere past the 4th week, that something was happening to him that had not happened on the 41 worlds before. But every time he reached for the shape of it, it slid away, because there was no enemy. There was only an old woman who apologized constantly, who never once raised her voice, who treated each new obstacle as a shared misfortune the two of them were enduring together. When a form failed, she grieved with him. When a clause demanded a new delay, she seemed almost embarrassed on the Dominion's behalf. And every clause was real. He checked. He had his legal officers comb the annexation code for fabrication, for forgery, for the smallest invented rule, and they found nothing. Margaret Oak never cited a law that did not exist. She never misquoted one. She simply knew them, all of them, the buried ones, the founding ones, the procedural ones that no living Vorik had read in 100 years because no world had ever made them necessary. "How do you know our law better than my own jurists?" he demanded one afternoon, when the survey had failed for the 3rd time, and the audit obligation had rebounded onto his office for the 3rd time. Margaret considered the question as though it were a fair one. "You wrote it to use on others," she said. "I had to read it because it was being used on me. That's a different kind of reading, magistrate. You skim the parts that give you power. I studied the parts that might give me time." She set the kettle on. "A drowning person learns the river better than the man who built the bridge." His superiors had begun to transmit displeasure. The Dominion measured its officers by speed, and Thren's annexation had now run longer than any in living record. There were inquiries. There were comparisons, unflattering ones, to magistrates who had taken 3 afternoons over 3 worlds. His pressure, the weight he carried into a room, had thinned to something he could feel slipping. Younger officers no longer stepped aside in the corridors of his own ship as quickly as they once had. He came to dread the office. He told himself it was the inefficiency. It was not the inefficiency. It was the cup. Every visit she set it down, full and steaming, and every visit it went cold in front of him, and he could not have said why he refused it except that to drink it would be to admit he was a guest in a room he had come to conquer. "You could make this stop," he told her once quietly near the end of the 7th week. "Sign the transfer, end it." "I'd be delighted to," said Margaret, "the moment it's lawful. I won't sign an unlawful transfer. That would be beneath both of us." She slid the next form across. More tea. In the 8th week, Threnvor Castle did the thing a Vorik officer was never supposed to need to do. He lost his patience, and he threatened force. He stood in the small office with his hand on the weapon at his belt, and he told her, in the flat dialect the Vorik used for sentencing, that the paperwork was finished, that he was seizing the colony's authority by hand this very hour, that she would produce the master seal or he would take it from her drawer himself, and that no clause she could name would stop a hand from closing on a seal. For the first time, Margaret Oak did not reach for the kettle. She folded her hands on the desk, and she looked at him with that clear, patient gaze, and she said, "I'd ask you to think very carefully before you do that. Not for my sake, for yours. You have no force to threaten me with." "No," she agreed. "I don't. I have something much worse." She opened a drawer slowly so he could see there was no weapon in it and laid a thin, yellowed page on the desk. It was old. It was the oldest paper he had seen in that room. Article 9, the founding article. The one they put first when they built your dominion before they decided which parts were convenient to remember. He read it twice. Any territory annexed under coercion, threat, or the application of force by a Dominion officer is rendered void in perpetuity. The annexation is dissolved. The world is declared free of claim, and the full cost of the failed campaign, every ship, every wage, every standard hour, is billed personally to the officer who broke the seal of lawful conduct. "Your founders were proud beings," Margaret said gently. "They wanted the galaxy to know the Dominion was different, that you didn't conquer like pirates, that you took only what was lawfully given. So they made it the highest crime an officer could commit to take by force what the law had not yet granted. They never imagined an officer might be made to want to. They thought the temptation would only ever come from weakness." She paused. "I've spent 11 weeks making sure you'd feel it." Thren's hand came off the weapon. It did so without his deciding it should. He could not fight her. If he fired a single shot, drew a single weapon, laid a single hand on the seal, he would not conquer the colony. He would free it forever, and bankrupt himself and his line for 10 generations doing it. He could not finish the annexation, because every path forward dissolved into another lawful delay. And he could not leave, because to withdraw a filed claim was itself a procedure, with its own forms, its own holds, its own waiting periods, all of which sat in the drawers behind the small gray-haired woman who had never once put any weight on the air. He was pinned to the spot by a body of law he had spent his whole life believing was a weapon that only pointed outward. "What are you?" he said. It was not a sentence a magistrate was meant to ask a clerk. Margaret rose and put the kettle on and answered him. "I'm a records clerk," she said. "That's all. That's the whole secret, magistrate. There's no fleet hiding in the hills. There's no army behind the silos. There never was. I want you to understand that because I think it's the part your people will have the hardest time believing when you go home and try to explain how you lost a war you never fought." She poured the tea. She set it down, full and steaming, in the same place she always set it. 11 weeks ago you walked in expecting me to be afraid of you. And the thing is, I was. I'm an old woman in a dusty office on a planet nobody important has ever heard of. You could kill me in a moment and no one in the galaxy would slow down. I knew that the whole time." She sat. "But I'd had 30 years to think about what I'd do if a day like this one ever came. 30 years of evenings reading law that no one made me read, in a job that bored almost everyone who ever held it. And somewhere in the 2nd decade, I understood the thing your Dominion forgot." "And what," said Thren very quietly, "did we forget?" That a law is only a weapon when you're the one in a hurry. Margaret turned her cup a quarter turn on its saucer, the way she did when she was choosing her words. You came here in a hurry because you measure yourselves by speed, and a being in a hurry can be trapped by anyone willing to be slow. You needed this to be over. I never needed it to be over. I could file forms until the day I died and consider it a life well spent. I had nowhere else to be. That's not weakness, magistrate. That's the deepest strength there is, and it never once showed up on your senses. Because you don't have an organ that can feel patience, you only feel pressure, and I never gave you any. Thren understood then why she had read as a stone at the bottom of a well. A submitting mind put out no weight. He had felt her quiet and called it surrender, but it had never been surrender. It had been the stillness of someone who had already decided, long ago, that she would not be moved, and who therefore had nothing left to strain against. He had spent 11 weeks pressing his whole life's force against a thing that simply did not push back, and was somehow still standing exactly where it had begun. Every form, he said, from the first one. From the first one, Margaret agreed. The intake triggered the hold. The hold gave me time to prepare the survey. The survey gave me grounds for the audits. The audits ran out the clauses I needed. And every clause spent one more day off the annexation window your own founders set. She glanced at a calendar on the wall, the only thing in the office that was not a drawer or a form. Which closes, by the way, the day after tomorrow. The window closed the day after tomorrow. Thren did not sleep on his ship that night, and the Vorek did not sleep easily even at the best of times. He read the annexation code from its first article to its last, the whole of it, the way Margaret Oak must have read it on 30 years of quiet evenings. And he saw, at last, the trap entire, not a single snare but a long, patient sequence, each piece lawful, each piece harmless on its own, each piece spending exactly the time she could not afford to give him and could afford herself to take forever. There was no clause he could break to escape it, because breaking a clause invoked Article 9, and Article 9 ruined him. There was no clause he could satisfy fast enough, because every clause she filed honestly opened two more she could file honestly after it. The annexation window was a length of rope the Dominion had tied around its own founder's wrists to prove its honor to the galaxy. She had simply held on to the other end and waited for the rope to run out. On the final morning, he went to the office one last time before the deadline. The audit obligations had by then rebounded fully onto his own administration. The Dominion's law required the claimant to prove diligence, and his repeated failed surveys now read, on the record, as Dominion negligence. His superiors had stopped sending displeasure. They had begun sending investigators. The bureaucracy he had carried to Vespers Reach like a sword had turned in his hand, and was now examining him, demanding to know why a magistrate of 41 conquests had spent 11 weeks unable to register a farm. "They're going to blame me," he said. He did not sit, he never sat. "Not the law, me. The window will close, the claim will lapse, your world will be free of it, and the Dominion will write that Magistrate Thren Vorkassel failed, that a clerk defeated me." "They'll write that," Margaret agreed. "For a while. Empires need someone to have failed so they don't have to notice the thing that actually beat them." She set the cup down, full, steaming, the same place as always. "But your investigators will read the file eventually. Some quiet one of them on some quiet evening the way I read yours, and that one will understand. And then your Dominion will have a choice to make about what kind of thing it wants to be, a thing that conquers, or a thing that keeps its word. You can't be both for very long. We were always going to make you choose. It just took one of us a long time to find out how." At the appointed hour, the annexation window closed. There was no alarm. No alarm was lawful. A small chime sounded from a device on Margaret's desk, the kind of chime that marks the end of a permitted period, and the claim on Vespers Reach lapsed, dissolved by nothing more violent than the passage of time it had been guaranteed by the Dominion's own founders. The colony was free of claim. It could not be reclaimed for one full standard cycle by the same code, and Margaret Oak had already, that morning, filed the forms that would begin a new and lawful delay the instant the Dominion tried again. Thren stood in the silence of the small office. No shot had been fired. No blood had been spilled. No weapon had left its holster. He had brought a war fleet to a farming world, and he was leaving with less than he had arrived with, and the only casualty was the certainty he had carried in his chest his entire life. That strength was a thing that pushed, and that anything which did not push back had already lost. "Why tell me all of this?" he said at last. "You could have let me leave a fool. You could have let me believe it was bad luck." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Because you're the one who's going to go home and tell them," she said. "And I'd rather you understood what you were telling them. That's not mercy, magistrate. It's just good record-keeping. The truth ought to be written down correctly. I've spent my whole life on that idea. I wasn't about to stop on the most important day of it." The fleet withdrew from Vespers Reach the next morning. It did not return. The investigators came, as Margaret had said they would, and the report they filed was not the one the Dominion wanted. It did not say that Thren Vorkassel had failed. It said that the annexation code, as written by the Dominion's own honored founders, could be lawfully and indefinitely obstructed by any defendant patient enough to obey it perfectly. It recommended that the code be quietly rewritten to remove the founding protections, to allow annexation by force after all, to strike Article 9, to make the Dominion faster. The Dominion read the recommendation and could not bring itself to act on it. To strike Article 9 was to admit, in writing, that the Dominion had only ever pretended to be lawful, that the honor its founders had been so proud of had been a costume worn over conquest. Some empires can survive saying that about themselves. The Vorek, who weighed authority by its honesty, who could feel a lie as a wrongness in the air, could not. The article stayed. And because the article stayed, every world the Dominion approached after Vespers Reach knew what Vespers Reach had done, and learned to read the code, and learned to be slow. The age of the afternoon annexation was over. It had been ended not by a fleet, not by a rebellion, not by a hero, but by an old woman who counted things in a dusty room and had simply declined to be in a hurry. Thren Vorkassel was not ruined. His superiors in the end could not punish a magistrate for obeying the law too well without admitting the law was the problem. He was reassigned to the Records Division, a posting meant as a disgrace. He did not experience it as one. He spent his evenings, for the first time in his life, reading the parts of the code that gave no one any power, and found he could not stop. A standard cycle after the claim lapsed, he requested permission to return to Vespers Reach, not as a magistrate. The request listed his purpose as verification of records, which was true, and as personal, which was also true, and which no Vorek had ever before written on an official form. The office was unchanged. The drawers, the towers of paper, the calendar, the small gray-haired woman with ink on 2 fingers, older now, a little slower, still putting out no weight on the air at all, and he understood this time that the quiet was not emptiness. It was a person who had decided what she was a long time ago and had never once had to strain to remain it. "Magistrate," Margaret said, pleased, as though he had arrived on time for an appointment neither of them had made. "Not any more," said Thren. "Records now, they thought it was a punishment." "And is it?" He considered the question honestly, because he had learned in that office that she deserved honest answers. "No," he said. Margaret Oak smiled and rose and put the kettle on. She set the cup down in the place she had always set it, full and steaming, and for the first time in everything that had passed between them, Thren Vorkassel picked it up and drank. It had gone cold 100 times in that room while he stood proud and refused it. It was warm now, because he had finally sat down. He thought that was probably the whole of what she had been trying to teach him, and that it had taken him an empire's worth of time to learn it. You cannot conquer people who refuse to stop being themselves. You can press your whole strength against them and feel nothing push back, and mistake that for weakness, right up until the day you understand that the thing which does not push is the only thing that never tires. Force is loud and force is fast, and force, in the end, gets bored. It needs to win, and it needs to win soon, and anything that is willing to simply wait will outlast it every single time. She didn't fire a shot. She never raised her voice. She just kept filing forms correctly forever, until the Empire ran out of the one thing it had never thought to bring enough of. She had all the time in the world, and in the end, that was the world.